From the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center, HEC-TV and the Danforth Center are proud to present Conversations, a discussion about global food security.
Welcome, everybody. This is the last of the conversations for 2012, but tonight's topic is global food security. I'm Matt Wolf. I chair the Danforth Friends Committee and would like to thank Molly Klein. Where are you, Molly? Molly, who chairs this committee. Thank you, Molly. And also would like to thank the Boeing Company, who has sponsored these for the last 5 years. Thank you, Boeing. As part of our partnership with HEC-TV, this evening's program will be recorded, and you can view that starting November 4th. This is on Sunday nights at 5 o'clock. It'll be repeated several nights. If you're on Charter, that's channel 989, and if you're on ATT Universe, that's channel 99. Also, you can access these through the Danforth Plant Science Center website. So, with that, I'd like to introduce Jim Carrington, the president of the Danforth Plant Science Center. Jim?
All right, thank you, Matt. I normally don't make comments or introductions ahead of conversations, but this is an exception. I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to welcome you all to this very special evening. The exception is because we have some very important people here today, and I want to make sure that I recognize them and that you get to acknowledge their presence here this evening. It's always an honor to host dignitaries, but we have a collection of dignitaries today that we've worked very close with over the past we've worked very closely with for the past many years. It's no accident that the Honorable Minister Nyira is here from Uganda. We've been working closely with scientists and institutions in Uganda for some time. As many of you know, these relationships continue to flourish, but they flourish because, in part, of the personal support and attention that we receive directly from the Honorable Minister. And I want to say thank you for all that you've done in partnership with the Danforth Center. I'm also very proud to say that the minister and I have a very special common bond, and perhaps if he has time, he can mention that later. Leaders from Uganda's most important agricultural institutions are with us here this evening. I'd like to introduce Dr. Emily Twinamasiko and Dr. James Agwong. If you would please stand. Dr. Twinamasiko is the Director General of the National Agricultural Research Organization in Uganda, an organization that has nearly 1,000 staff and scientists working in 15 different institutes across Uganda. Dr. Agwong is Director of the National Crop Resources Research Institute, which is located, the primary facilities are located in Namalongi, which houses a number of scientists that we work with very closely. Thank you, Emily and James, for coming. I also want to recognize several collaborators that we have here at the Danforth Center. These are collaborators here for a biannual scientific review of our cassava virus resistance project that we work with in collaboration with colleagues in both Uganda and Kenya. From Namalonge in Uganda, which is just outside Kampala, we have Titus Aliche. Please stand when I mention your name. And from Nairobi, Kenya, I'm going to list a number of names here, but please stand when I mention your name. From Nairobi, we have Simon Gichuki, Douglas Miano, Margaret Karembu, and Lena Tripathi. When we talk about our collaborators around the world, specifically in Africa, these are the individuals we're talking about, and we're very proud to be associated with them. Thank you for all that you do, and thank you for coming this evening. Finally, a little closer to home, I'm proud to welcome Chancellor Brady Deaton. Chancellor Deaton is no stranger to any of you here. He's the leader of one of our great land-grant universities and a critical partner with us at the Danforth Center. Chancellor Deaton has been a very committed, involved member of our Board of Trustees, and I want to thank you for all the work that you've done helping us grow and what you'll be doing with us in the future. So now let me turn the program over to my friend, Professor Jim Davis, who will lead the conversation.
I want to join the speakers who came before, Matt Wolf and Jim Carrington, in welcoming such a large audience to listen to a conversation and then to take part in a conversation about such an important topic. And I'm honored to be on a platform with two experts in the general topic of agricultural economics and the specific topic of food insecurity, hunger. Those are tremendously important problems. And they're where I want to start the conversation, because over the last several weeks, I've been reading a lot about food insecurity, hunger, worst of all, childhood stunting, where little kids, 2, 3, simply don't grow to their full potential because of the absence of adequate nutrition. I've been reading a lot about those problems. As I start the conversation, I wasn't quite sure whether to start with a broad perspective that Brady Deaton could offer, given his background working both in East Africa and as an agricultural economist, or to turn to Minister Nira, who could give us a case example, a specific example from Uganda. I flipped a coin and decided to start with a case study. So if you, Minister, could talk a bit about agriculture and food insecurity, or food security, in Uganda, and then I want to turn to Brady Deaton to talk about those issues more globally. But first, Uganda, a population of maybe 35 million, largely rural, but everyone doesn't grow enough or grow their own food. You have a significant food problem, but how big? And how rapidly can it be reduced?
Well, Jim, let me first of all say how thankful I am to be with you and to be with this congregation. I think it is a great honor that I'm here to be able to share my views with everybody who is around. And I thank the organizers, and in particular, I would want to thank Jim Carrington, who, when we met in Uganda, he extended an invitation for me to come over to this place and be able to share views with the people. I thank Jim for that. At the same time, I would want to indicate, perhaps for those who may not know who I am, I took my education in this country way back in 1966. And I was registered at Kansas State University, but for some reason, I had to change from there. Went on to San Luis Obispo, but I ended up at the University of California, Berkeley, and for that matter, in fact, we share much in common with Jim Carrington, and when I got to know that, in fact, we are both alumni of the same place, I think it was a great occasion and a great pleasure for us to be reunited. And for that matter, when I was at Kansas State University, I was able to move to Kansas, Missouri, but I missed coming to St. Louis. Thank God that at least I'm here. With that background, I would want to perhaps also indicate that Jim Carrington and I, when we were in Kampala, we had a lot of issues to reminisce about. And this was the battle that him and I were in, more or less in the same brigade. And this is the battle of being able to look at the challenge, the global challenge of assisting or contributing to the challenges of humanity, and more so on the global challenge of food security. And we took a long time to think about the growing population throughout the whole world, and more so, the growing population in the developing world. And I did indicate to him, and I've repeated this when I'm here, that the fight against poverty, the fight of emancipating our people, especially in the developing world, from poverty and transforming them into better livelihoods, would not be a fight that is restricted or limited to individuals in the developing world, but rather it is an important element that is global, because what happens to Africa, what happens to Asia, actually affects United States, and it affects the entire world elsewhere, because right now we are a global village. And I told Jim, and he agreed with me, and even contributed more, that in fact, that fact alone brought us together to be able to not only cooperate in our fight to emancipate our people, but rather to contribute to humanity globally. And for that matter, I see what is being done in the United States, whether it is research or whether it is anything else, it should not be seen as United States, and for that matter, the national interest of the United States, but rather it is a global national interest. Now that brings me to
Uganda and its problem.
To Uganda. The first issue in our countries is how secure or how insecure is our people in as far as hunger and starvation is concerned. The population of Uganda is now round about 34 million. And about 30 years ago, it was about 7 million. And obviously, that growth rate is not very encouraging. But on the other hand, Uganda happens to have one of the highest growth rates, or rather birth rates. We are now at around about 3.2 to 3.3% growth rate. And that population definitely has to be catered for as we continue, and quickly too. The structure of our agriculture in Uganda is we have between 68 and perhaps 80% of our farmers who are still in the subsistence structure. In other words, 8 out of every 10 of our farmers are still peasants.
Can they feed themselves even? Can they feed their families?
Yes, that's what I'm coming to. That the mere fact that, in fact, they are peasants, it means that they are producing food for themselves. Each household produces to ensure that their food is secure. They don't produce surplus, but if it is surplus, then it means, in fact, now they are getting into the area of enterprise agriculture. And therefore, our challenge is to transform that particular subsistence farming community into enterprise farmers so that they are able to produce more and more for others, over and above the food security of their own. And therefore, the situation in Uganda is such that I wouldn't say that we are food insecure, but it is very possible, and I think it is, that we are nutritionally food insecure. And I want this one perhaps to come out, because you can have food which you can eat, but it may not necessarily be nutritionally secure.
And what population, what proportion of the population, and then I want to turn to Chancellor Deaton, what proportion of the population is nutritionally insecure?
I would say, I can't quote figures straight away, but I would say that definitely you are looking at over 50%.
Over 50%.
Over 50%. And I would want to go back to at least be able to put this in context, that in Uganda, we are not food insecure, because it so happens that we can actually feed ourselves. So the food availability is not a problem. In some cases, when you hear that as far as Uganda is concerned, we have a problem with the food security, it is actually the accessibility. Because there is one thing to have food, it's another thing to access to it. And then the difference between hunger and starvation also matters. Because I don't think, in as far as hunger is concerned, that Uganda is really threatened at all. No. But you may find that some households, individuals in different places, may have a little bit of starvation here and there. That basically implies only accessibility to food. Because you may have food in one area of the country, where that food may not necessarily be accessible to other parts of the country. But otherwise, we don't have food insecurity in Uganda.
But now let me turn to Chancellor Deaton. Do other countries have food insecurity? Are they suffering from hunger? To what extent is food security a global issue, at least in the developing world, across Africa and Asia, if you want to stretch that far?
Jim, thank you. And let me first thank you for being here. And it's an honor to be on the stage here and the opportunity to speak with Minister Nier from Uganda. We met a couple of years ago in Kampala. And being here at the Danforth Plant Science Center is very special. So, Jim, thank you, and the staff and leadership here at the Danforth Center. I'm coming at this from the standpoint of a history of having done research in Africa and Asia and other parts of the world, and also from my role as the chair of the Board for International Food and Agricultural Development, and sort of looking at this globally, picture globally.
And that board advises AID and works with Feeding the Future?
Feed the Future, right. And directly, it's a presidentially appointed board of 7 people who advise the administrator of USAID, Rod Shaw, who's a friend of many of us here in this room and is so present globally. And we're at a time when the initiative being undertaken by Administrator Shaw is somewhat unique in developing partnerships with the private sector, the NGO world, universities, and government, whole of government in the United States and other governments around the world to really focus on the Feed the Future issues in 19 targeted countries. Most of those are in Africa and also include Bangladesh, Cambodia, Haiti, and Guatemala here in this hemisphere. But the issue of global food security is fundamental, and this issue of having 7 billion population in the world today, and the minister and I were just chatting before, We're headed toward another billion population by 2025 and yet an additional billion population by 2050. So we're talking about adding an enormous growth in population, stressing the climate of the world, the water supply of the world, and most importantly, the scientific knowledge of the world. And so these partnerships have been viewed as a way of really addressing the issue by getting everyone involved in them, and in this country looking at the fundamental issues of science across NIH and SF and what university research is doing with foundations in the private sector to bring that knowledge to bear on the problem being in general terms looking at the 7 billion population we have with upwards of 1 billion, certainly 800 million, viewed as being insecure from the standpoint of food and nutrition. And I think the minister made a very important emphasis on the nutritional aspects. It's not enough to have quantity. You've got to have the quality that enables people to live a decent life and to rear their children. And Administrator Shaw at USAID, as he's focused on these 19 food insecure, particularly food insecure countries that have expressed a willingness on their part to step forward and marshal the resources of their own government to bear on the problems, as has occurred in Uganda and in many other countries of southern and eastern Africa and Ghana and Mozambique, a variety of countries that fit the feed the future criteria. This commitment is fundamental, and it is somewhat new in the world. And I have to commend Rod Shaw for the energy and vision in working with leaders such as we have here with us today in addressing these issues. He's particularly placed emphasis on the first 1,000 days, from pregnancy through 2 years of age for children. The stunting issue you mentioned is absolutely an appalling concern to see children at that early stage be condemned for life to operate at a subpar level. So
and not only physically, but mentally.
Physically and exactly, it's particularly mentally, being particularly important, prone to disease, prone to the scourges that come with that kind of marginal existence. And even in the few years that, the past 3 years of work under the Feed the Future initiative has seen an additional 8.8 million is the estimate that USAID gives of children being fed in ways that they were not fed before through work at the country level with the ministries of agriculture, the universities in their country, the NGOs that are at work, and certainly the country's agricultural research system has responded in very meaningful ways, working with private sector businesses, with the NGOs who are committed to ensuring that feeding programs make a difference. So we're, in the past 3 years, it's significant. I brought a copy, and I think we have a website. I would urge everyone to look at the website of USAID on the Feed the Future progress that they have made, because it's quite significant. And it has enabled not only 1.8 million more farmers to have the management capability, the scientific knowledge, the improved seeds, the value-added organizations of cooperatives and marketing systems, thanks to that partnership. That means the countries themselves own this issue. So this is very different in strategy of USAID than in the past.
But now let me come back to Uganda. The minister was talking about a peasantry that's engaged in farming. My guess would be that they are practitioners of tradition. They plant what they're used to planting, they plow or don't plow, they don't use fertilizer. How do you change the culture? I've read that changing agricultural practice from one culture to another is one of the hardest kinds of changes to succeed at.
Well, and let me say, I feel very strongly about this issue, and I ally myself with my colleague, University of Chicago economist T.W. Schultz, who said farmers will respond to opportunity. They respond to incentives. And I'm sure the minister could give all kinds of examples in Uganda, as I can from places that I have been. So given the opportunity, globally, farmers respond, and they change their culture. They adopt the new crops. They adopt the new food varieties. And, for example, under Feed the Future in Bangladesh, just in the past 3 years, there's been a transformation of 625,000 hectares into new rice varieties, and with new fertilizing techniques, drawing on deeply planted briquettes of urea, nitrogen fertilizer, applied at the root level so that it makes a total difference in the production of the crop, rather than about 70% of it being lost to runoff. So these are just practical changes. That given the proof, farmers will adopt to it, and we're seeing that occur around the world.
They can adopt to it if they can afford it, but can the farmers in Uganda afford fertilizer?
Well, I think I would want to agree with my colleague here. Farmers will respond to opportunities.
So will most people.
Exactly. Now, obviously, there is the question of affordability. There can be availability, but affordability. I think our farmers, first of all, the systems may not necessarily be giving them the opportunity to be able to respond to the factors of production that are there, because basically, really, you are talking about improved seeds. You are talking about the technologies that overcome the water problem. In fact, most of the agriculture that is taking place in our systems are really rain-fed. But you are talking about, do you have to produce irrigation, and what kind of technology do you need? You are looking at soils which are getting too old. They have been mined over time. And you are talking about the availability of fertilizers. Now, obviously, most of our farmers can only farm as much as their energies can actually hold them on. So when you introduce mechanization, naturally, they would just adopt to this mechanization. Whether they have been trained or they have not been trained, they also realize. And then if you produce markets and you give the farmers that there is an outlet for their products, naturally the farmers will respond. So actually the inherent problems that may actually be inhibiting the increase in agricultural production may be that, in fact, we are not providing the farmers with the conditions that will stimulate growth in production. And we should not forget that under the circumstances under which we are living, where you've got climate change, increased populations, need for technology input, we cannot increase agricultural production unless until we introduce our farmers and actually educate them to adopt methods, modern methods of production. And therefore, that is where you find research, scientific innovations, and technological inputs as a major input in agricultural production. We will not be able to change them. We should not forget that we are dealing with a constant of the natural resources. You cannot increase the size of this world. You can only deal with the soils and the size of the world that it is. So in order for you to increase productivity per unit area, you simply have to put in technology. And therefore, the farmers, the challenge we have is to indicate to the farmers that we have no choice but to actually get into scientific methods of agricultural production in order to meet the challenges and pressures of increased need for food.
But at least in this country, mechanization takes energy. Petrochemicals, gasoline, diesel, and we're talking about sustainable agricultural practices. Yet if you're borderline food insecure, do you want to use arable land to grow biodiesel or the stuff that biodiesel is made of? And there's another issue. Not only is population growing, but I've read that in much of the developing world, a significant amount of food is lost to spoilage and waste. Maybe as much as a third of production is lost. Is that a real problem or just a problem I've read about?
Oh, it's a real problem. And let me make a comment that I think ties together the real keen observation of the minister as well. And it relates to the whole issue of science being applied to the practical level agriculture in a way that achieves less, yes, food post-harvest losses are about 30% of the food crop worldwide, actually, in all countries, but particularly in countries that do not have the knowledge base and or the techniques and marketing systems to alleviate some of that losses that's occurred. So earlier this year, I happened to be at a USAID workshop, Inception workshop in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. I went out to Sokoine University at Morogoro, where we have a USAID-sponsored project that's led by Ohio State University, in fact, with a number of collaborating universities. But the point I'm trying to make is there, They were growing an important food crop, in this case, tomatoes and other horticultural crops. But let's focus on tomatoes for a minute, because here was a case where much of the tomatoes were being lost due to fungi and rot occurring in the field. There was experiments going on at the university with private sector firms involved in helping lay out the research and working with the scientists at the university to look at different mulching systems. Now, this recent Ph.D. that was guiding the research of a group of graduate students was in constant contact with her laboratory back in the United States at Penn State University, in fact, where she had received her doctorate. So as we're out in the field, she's showing us around. They're looking at different, discovered, in fact, that one of their native grasses is one of the best mulching systems possible, better than some that would be more costly due to making it made from plastic or other methods. And she is checking out the physiology with one of the lead scientists in this country as we're going through the research process. So that is why we've placed so much emphasis under USAID's efforts, the administrator's efforts, on sustainable intensification. We have to find a way to, as the minister said, feed a rapidly growing population with greater knowledge built on basic science, with translational efforts to get it into the field, and with these highly trained people in all these countries working. And it's important that they be trained and have the educational opportunities, and then can work with graduate students from all over, in this case, the East African countries. We're in school at Sokoine, and marshaling the scientific expertise of that faculty that's trained and ready to go forward with the science knowledge, with the private sector partners, and the incentives that can be provided to small-scale farmers to produce this food crop and get it into the market.
And I think of 4-H as a way to get education to young people. When I was a kid in high school, one of the major organizations was the FFA, the Future Farmers of America. They were in high school, but they were learning how to farm, and they were learning best practice at the time. I graduated in 1953. God knows what best practice is now. But it was FFA and 4-H, and I understand there are 4-H clubs in Uganda. Am I accurate?
Yes, in fact, basically, really, we are getting back into the young farmers and so on. I might say that sometimes the globalization has also had its own toll, because these days you've got the activists who say, in fact, the children's rights. And when they say children's rights, then a child is not supposed to dig, because that is now child labor. You can be taken to prison and be prosecuted because you are telling the child to dig. But that being as it is, definitely I think the young farmers associations that were very active in the about 40 years ago, and the participation of the young farmers in the extension services and so on, played a very big part in mentoring the young people and getting them interested in agricultural production, and also in agriculture as an enterprise. Now, the issue of not training the young people in agriculture because of child rights and the rest of it and so on, in my view, brought in that element of the children sitting down and hoping that, in fact, things can be done for them. But in Uganda, in particular, I think we are revisiting this, and we've gone very seriously. We've got patriotic clubs, and in these patriotic clubs, in fact, we are trying to make sure that the young people get involved in agriculture, and also getting, in fact, conditions that can stimulate agricultural production and productivity by making sure that the young farmers get to see that agriculture can not only be a profession, but it can also an enterprise which is paying, because unemployment is becoming a very big problem. And in the case of Uganda, as it is in the case of Africa, and I believe in the whole developing world, I think agricultural sector is the only sector that can provide employment for the majority of the young people, because our countries, the level of industrialization.
Will it provide sufficient income along with employment?
I would say, as of now, no. because in fact agriculture is seen as something that does not pay quite a lot. And therefore there is quite a lot that has to be done to make sure that in fact agriculture is seen as an enterprise which is paying a form of employment, so that in fact the majority of our young people who are mainly rural can also get employment in the rural areas.
Are young people, families, are they moving in any numbers into urban areas, or are they still living on the farm?
I would say I think quite a good amount of people, of the young people, are actually getting urbanized. And that is from 2 or 3 angles. First of all, in fact, the urbanization is moving away from what used to be the urban sector and having trading centers also becoming urbanized. And at the same time, the activities in these urban or semi-urban or peri-urban, the activities in there are not agriculture. That's why, in fact, in a case like Uganda, and I believe the other countries of Africa as well, are actually emphasizing agro-processing and value addition to agricultural products as a form of industrialization. That means, in fact, we are moving the industrialization based on the agricultural products through a value-added chain over time. So it is true that many of the young people would want to go into the urban environment rather than in the rural environment.
But if they move into the urban environment, they will still need to eat.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah, it's an important point here. And let me say, as someone who is sitting in this chair only because of 4-H Club, growing up in eastern Kentucky, where the university's extension system, as we have here in Missouri, was so powerful. And it's at the heart of actually the BIFAD legislation. Representative Finley is always emphasizing, still, he wrote the legislation, co-sponsored it with Senator Humphrey at that in 1976, but still is advocating training the young people in the ways of that rural market structure. And
I'm just the moderator because I wasn't in the 4-H Club.
Right, okay. No, they're all, it takes all types. But, and all backgrounds for sure. But in Africa, it's interesting that the most rapid growth in 4-H Club membership in the world is in Southern Africa today, lining up with some of the most pressing food needs. So that's a fascinating aspect of the development of youth. And I think the minister said it very, very well, that the hope for employment is not only the application of science, because we've seen economic development progress throughout history is built on productive agricultural systems somewhere in the world, so you have that food surplus to be able to do something else with. Yeah. And so that's fundamental. But the more that the countries can work to promote that job development, working with the value chain, the inputs, the marketing structure, and the ultimately wholesaling and retailing of food products, there's job creation that goes along with that. And that can be very important, particularly at a time when we're facing such enormous growth in demand with the population and with what we hope, if we maintain peace and stability in the world, will be also growth in incomes of people, so that demand for food will continue to grow very significantly.
But without conscious effort, income can go up, GDP can go up, and people can still be food insecure.
Oh, sure.
Because
that's right.
If there are significant inequalities in the population, some will be quite well off and very secure, absolutely, and some at the bottom will still be hungry.
No, absolutely.
I would want to perhaps indicate that given the circumstances, that the greatest opportunities for the rural employment of our people in the developing world is in the agricultural sector, then in fact the next point is the challenge that we face. How do you make agriculture attractive to the young people who are coming up, so that in fact they go into agriculture as a form of employment? It is one thing to see that agriculture, the agricultural sector, provides the greatest opportunity and is the major employment sector for the people, for the young people in the rural areas. Now the issue is, how do you make it attractive? I think that is the greatest challenge that we have, to be able to make agriculture either through marketing, to make it more attractive, or through making sure that in fact you reduce the drudgery that is associated with agricultural production and productivity. And for that matter, you don't only look at the field production as the agricultural subset, but rather the agro-processing and value addition also being also part of the agriculture. And then the other challenge is to make sure that you've got the extension service that is effective enough to educate the farmers. In other words, to meet the supply requirements, the supply demand of the farmers, because these farmers require education first in order for them to be able to appreciate that agriculture is paying and that the challenges of agriculture can be overcome by the scientific methods which are coming out from the research input.
I just was going to emphasize that, and the example I used in Tanzania, it's the application of cutting-edge science all the way down to the farm level that can ultimately make the kind of differences. It takes the extension service, it takes the country's agricultural experiment station system to ensure that food availability is there. And farmers and local communities will be very responsive, not only to the production potential, but also the market development potential. And we've seen cases around the world again and again in history of imbalanced economic growth, where you do not sustain and lead this integration from the rural to the urban. And it leads to very difficult social situations. And in fact, since food is sort of the numeraire for wages in urban areas, you've got to have that food supply in place to prevent the kind of social disruption that can too easily occur. And we saw a recent example of that in 2007, 2008, when world food prices spiraled upward due to climate changes, due to all kinds of disruptions that were occurring. And as you mentioned earlier, some of the use of agricultural products and fuel and in energy sources. Suddenly we saw a spiral, and there were documented cases of about 30 cases of social unrest occurring as a result of the food shortages that occurred.
Just last month, I saw an article in the paper, the UN predicting food crisis because of rising prices thanks to drought in Russia and other wheat-producing areas. And that's a major issue. If people move into urban areas and need to buy food, then a price spike will surely lead to some urban unrest. But I've had enough questions. Let me turn to audience questions. And the first one is of some interest. I have a whole bunch here to pick from. Feed the Future is a collaboration with other countries. Do you think this approach is achieving greater success than if the U.S. were to act alone? That's a good question for you, Chancellor.
Well, I think the U.S. cannot act alone and be successful. No matter how positive a foreign policy we have, we do not have the credibility to work in other countries without the kind of partnerships of those countries, their research, their scientists, their universities, their communities, and they are the countries that have the most at stake here. And that partnership can be a benefit to private investors in the United States, certainly, but it fundamentally requires participation of the NGO community to address these needs of children particularly. And we're seeing that partnership play its way out in a way that I think we have not seen historically at all, because we do not have had all the pieces working together. And that begins with the U.S. government agencies, the whole of government approach that Rod Shaw talks about. BIFAD has suggested that a whole of university approach can be thrown in there with the whole effort occurring in countries around the world. With that partnership, we have the potential that has not at all been realized. We've not seen this kind of progress in the past, to my knowledge. I think we will be able to document this better in 10 years. But I think we're seeing a progress occurring now in a way that we have not seen in earlier historical periods.
Is there any chance that a future administration's interest in reducing the size of the budget would have an effect on our ability to contribute internationally?
Absolutely, there's no question about that. And again, the government, U.S. government, has been able to marshal $3.5 billion were devoted to the L'Aquila Conference 3 years ago, and that leveraged about 18 million. I'm sorry, that's the 3.5 billion. It leveraged about 18 plus billion from private sector funds and other government agencies globally through the work of the CGIAR system, through the work of groups like the Donald Amsler Plant Science Center. More importantly, in terms of volume, was what the countries themselves committed to doing. It's been very, very significant. So this is a truly global effort in a way that we have not seen before. I picked up a USA Today news story that I just was too good not to resist bringing with me today, but a whole section, some of you probably saw this, on investing in Africa. This is the private sector saying Africa is a place where we can partner and develop. It's going to take significant investments from the private sector, from the NGO community, but fundamentally it starts with the commitment made by leaders in the African countries, and we have one of the great examples of it right here with us today, and that's very, very substantive.
I want to be sure everyone in the audience knows what an NGO is. It's a non-governmental organization.
CARE, Catholic Relief, Church World Service, on and on, yes.
Does the Danforth Plant Science Center qualify as an NGO?
It's a no. I don't. It's a nonprofit research organization.
I think it is a development partner.
Okay.
And another term that the audience will hear is civil society organizations, which I heard for the first time from Secretary of State Clinton at the United Nations a few weeks ago when she introduced the second new alliance group of countries being added to the earlier three that had been at work.
And are we a member of the civil society?
We are, and many of our church organizations, civil society includes Kiwanis clubs, chambers of commerce, and about every other.
Every once in a while, when I turn on the radio, I'm not sure we're in a civil society, but that's another issue.
Question.
Here's a question for you, Minister. Can Uganda profit or benefit from the food research conducted in other African countries, or are they isolated to some degree? Do you collaborate with other countries and learn from them, or is Uganda alone?
I had just put down exactly that point which I wanted to talk about.
Briefly.
Yes. In the sense that there is a lot of information and knowledge throughout the whole world, which information we can utilize without necessarily going back to do research in our own situations. And therefore, we can save a lot in terms of investment in production and productivity by using technology transfer from elsewhere. The most important part is to see what kind of collaboration and what nature of collaboration can facilitate that technology transfer such that we are able to benefit from that. A good example is, in fact, I think he mentioned about, I think it was you who said, does Donald Danforth qualify? And I say development partner. And that's exactly the point I was trying to indicate, that in fact the collaboration that we have with an institution of this nature in plant breeding, plant science, and so on, helps very much to facilitate the technology transfer as well as the knowledge generation that's required. And therefore, I think in this view, I would say yes.
Yeah, one great Southern African example, I believe, Minister, you would agree, is the Southern Corridor development. Yeah, well, I mean, the Southern African countries are collaborating in many ways scientifically, and but then even in Tanzania, you've got in the Southern Corridor of that country, multiple nations working with investors from Africa and other parts of the world. Also
now you said
involved.
Southern Africa. Are you including or not South Africa?
Yes.
In terms of scientific expertise, particularly, yes.
Okay.
I would want perhaps to qualify that basically, you see, agriculture does not develop on its own. It has got many elements that eventually make agricultural development a success. For instance, even if you produced so much without infrastructure, you would find that, in fact, you are unable to transport your products where you want them in the markets and so on. So infrastructure becomes part and parcel of agricultural development. It facilitates, it stimulates agricultural production because it is facilitating the marketing part of it. Then let me also mention about energy. You did mention about energy. Energy is so important. When we talk about biofuel and the rest of it and so on, even if you wanted to produce livestock would require feed. And these feeds will come from corn and other elements. So you're going back to agricultural production in order to sustain livestock. And then you're looking at energy in terms of industrial processing of agricultural produce. And therefore, you're looking at energy as part and parcel of the agricultural production system. Then you look at other elements as well, when you look at the investment, there is no any single person in the world who would want to invest in an insecure environment. So you are looking at peace and security as being prerequisites of international investment in agriculture. So I think agricultural development should not be seen in isolation from these elements: infrastructure, energy, peace and security, and other elements. And therefore, when we are looking at development partners, we look at development partners who are actually appreciating these elements because they've got to develop at the same pace in order for us to move forward.
Please describe, this is for you, Minister, please describe the relationship between food security, public health, and disease prevention on health security in Uganda. So you have food security, public health, disease prevention, a whole lot tied together.
Yes. Again, it comes to just what I've just been saying, that agriculture cannot develop on its own. You need a healthy population in order to get engaged in agriculture. And in fact, if you go to malaria, which is rampant, naturally you will not have a healthy population which will engage itself in agriculture. And I would say that I think, I would say that in fact agriculture and public health are intricately interwoven. You need, in fact, agriculture for a healthy population, but on the other hand, you need a healthy population to produce. Mm-hmm. And I would think that, in fact, if we're to be moving forward the agricultural sector, we need also to invest heavily in public health.
I've been told we're out of time, so I'm going to direct the last question to you, Chancellor Deaton. If we don't solve the food security problem in the next 50 years, how does that impact families in the developed world?
Well, it would have a significant impact because we would have a global demand for a relative food shortage. So you would have real pressures on prices and relatively more of the consumer dollar being spent on the food, which means you're going to be spending less on other sectors of the economy. So you'll see major price adjustments, a major reduction in the quality of life for all of the planet that is interrelated, and that means everybody today, because we live in a global community.
And in this country, the demand for food stamps keeps climbing.
That's right, and we all have a very, very large interest in elevating the quality of life throughout the world, sure, throughout the globe.
I recognize we haven't talked about climate change either, but we do have to draw the evening to a close. Last words from anybody? Jim Carrington, you want to give the benediction?
I'm not going to give a benediction, but I will just give a closing thought before I give my thanks to this exceptional panel. A few minutes before the program this evening, I was in a private room with the minister and the Director General and the Director for just a brief chat, and he said something that's just fundamentally, I'll never forget this. You said it in Uganda and you said it again here. If we think about issues of food security in what we consider faraway places like the middle of Africa, it's not their problem, it's our problem because it affects us. We're all in this together. That's my closing thought. Chancellor Deaton, thank you so much, not only for this evening, but for all that you do.
Thank you.
Minister Niera, it's wonderful to see you again. Thank you so much for coming this far and for participating. And of course, Jim Davis. Jim, you're spectacular. Matt Wolf and Molly Klein, thank you so much for organizing this series, particularly this evening. Thank you all again for coming. Drive safely. We'll see you again later.